Hey guys, Phil Baumhardt here. So for today's video, I'm going to be reviewing the book Confederate Bowie Knives of the Georgia State Arsenal by Josh Phillips. This is a book that's intended as a reference for collectors of Civil War paraphernalia, but as a knife maker, there's also some very useful things in here if you're interested in making historically accurate Bowie knives. So I wanted to make my own D-handled Bowie knife, and this is the one that I ended up making. This is just a piece of 5160 square stock, or not square stock, flat stock. And before I set out making this, I wanted to kind of do my research to make as a historically accurate a replica as I could. And this is the book that I ended up buying. So it's a pretty expensive book. It's over $60 right now on Amazon. So I wanted to show you guys what's inside in case you're interested in doing your own research into the D-handled Bowie knives, because this is all that you're going to find in this book. But it's a very neat resource, and it sets out kind of a typology of these type of knives. So let me show you what's inside. Guys, here's a look at what the front cover looks like. This is, I believe, a independent publishing, so it's got a very glossy pages, kind of an odd font, but it's a neat book nonetheless. So the story of these Georgia State Arsenal knives comes from a Union soldier named Captain Nelson, and he actually was part of Sherman's march to the sea, and one of the places that they stopped in that campaign was Milledgeville in Georgia, and that's where the Armory, Arsenal, and I believe the penitentiary was for the Confederacy. So these Bowie knives were housed in the arsenal, and so there's actually an excerpt from his diary describing him finding this knife. So that's kind of an interesting piece of history. And so this is the knife that Nelson found. So it's got the knife, the scabbard, and the belt. And essentially the impetus for the creation of these Bowie knives, these D-guard Bowie knives, was Governor Brown of Georgia. And so what he wanted was pikes and Bowie knives issued to all of his men. He thought that was very important. So he put out an order, and he had a pattern knife made up, and he wanted knives made specifically to be issued to the troops. So other than his knives, all the other Bowie knives of the Confederacy were all, individually made and privately purchased. To my knowledge, these are the only knives that were made specifically to be issued to the Confederate troops. So here in Chapter 2, there's a list of all the people that made knives that were found in the arsenal, or from their records. So I think there was a total of about 3,000 to 4,000 knives that were made, and it has the name of the maker, their profession, where they were located, and then how many knives that they made. And there's one guy down here at the very bottom who made one knife. So there's some dedication for you. But that's some interesting statistics there. And then this is a copy of the storekeeper's record for the arsenal. So it's got not only the numbers of knives, but also rifles and other accoutrement. So that's kind of a neat factoid if you're kind of a Civil War buff. But the knives were all to be issued with belts. That's part of why we have the information on the belt and the buckle, which is kind of neat. So Milledgeville was not where the knives were made. It was simply where they were stored in the arsenal. And he makes the distinction of arsenal versus armory. Armory being where the firearms were kept, and then arsenal is where all the non-firearm weaponry was kept. So when the Union took Milledgeville, they burned much of the stores and threw some of it in the river. So that's what this guy is doing. He's scouring the river bottom and coming up with these artifacts. And so the meat of this book is a topology of these Bowie knives. And so there's a little bit in the back here, types 1 through 6. So much like our Swords of the Viking Age, this book actually breaks down different types of Bowie knives. And this is the first book I've seen that does that, which is kind of neat. So, like type 1, which is the knife that Nelson found, it's got a wrought iron guard, a ferrule, and he describes the making of it. So some interesting things about the way that the sheaths made. This is the one thing that is kind of cohesive throughout all these different types of knives, even though they're made by individual people. they've all got the same type of sheath, which is a leather sheath. They've got a copper rivet and then a couple of pewter rivets. That's tin, one piece of tin that's been folded over and soldered. There's a couple pins in there. And then he talks about the belt loop specifically being too small and narrow for the knife. And so many of the sheaths that they found, that's actually broken off because it's just such a narrow belt loop that it's not meant to, it's not sufficient enough to support the weight of the knife, which is about 1 to 2 pounds. But this book has got some nice photos, details of the hilt, different angles, which is really nice to have. A lot of color photos. That's another thing I like about this. It's not the biggest book or the highest quality, but it's got good quality photos. So this is one that's been dubbed the Yankee Slayer. That's the capture tag. So the guy that the Union soldier that pilfered this dubbed it the Yankee Slayer. That was not something that the Confederate owner put on there. So I thought that was kind of funny. I guess many of these handles were made of walnut. And this is a officer's version. That's a bone handle that's been carved. And it does describe these back edges as being, these false edges as being sharpened. Describes the blade length, usually about 16 inches, 22 inches overall. That's the type 1. And then here we are into the type 2. So here's an example of one where the belt loop came off and the soldier cut 2 slits in the sheath that he could run his belt through. So these large Bowie knives were kind of described as being impractical weapons. I never really saw much use in combat, but a lot of the Confederate soldiers liked to carry them. And so clearly that soldier liked his knife enough that even though the sheath broke, he made a way to carry it around with him still. You got some river finds. So this type 5 is similar to the type of knife that I made, so that means it's got a wide carved grip with a draw knife, just the way that I did it, as well as no ferrule on the handle itself. So this kind of knife was the big, where the back of the D guard swoops up like that. That's kind of what I was modeling my knife off of. And then the type 6, like this is a one that they say is a blacksmith knife, which many of these knives were all made, I guess, by machine. The people who made these were actually called mechanics for that reason. But he kind of dismisses these as crudely made blacksmith knives, but that's kind of what my interest is. But you can see how this area of the blade here is wider than in here, and so that's caused from, I would imagine, he hammered out the clip point, and then to remove some of the curve that way, he hammered out this portion. But you do get some nice some belly in there, so this would be a good chopper, and you can see that it just fits right up to the guard there. So this is where my interest primarily lays, in the blacksmith knives, and there's not really much information on that, nor there's not really great information about how they were made per se, but there is small little details, nuggets of information that I found interesting. And then in the back of the book, there's a little bit of information of who these knives may have been issued to and where they may have gone in their travels throughout the Civil War. So one of the things I really like about this book is the kind of the detailed photo. And it describes these grips being carved by hand with a draw knife. So that's really neat to see, and you also get to kind of see details of the fit and construction of how these knives are made. And so with these guards, where you can clearly see that the metal here is thinner than in here, that's been worked with a hammer, probably forged by hand. So I think that's really neat, and that's exactly the same way that I was making my knife. Now, if we go back to the Type 1s, it describes the guards as being very uniform, and they're so uniform that some experts speculated that these were actually cast iron, but the book confirms that these are in fact wrought iron guards, which could be made bent over using a jig, and I guess they could be worked hot or cold, is what they say, which I found kind of interesting. Many of these blades also were painted, and the guards all had something on them called japanning, which japanning was a mixture of asphalt pitch, linseed oil, and turpentine. So that's kind of an interesting detail there on how they coated their blades and the guards. This is one of the knives that was in a fire, so that's why it's missing the handle, and apparently it was bent from the heat, which is kind of an interesting detail. Kind of reminds me of the swords that were originally killed in the Viking Age. But yeah, for a knife maker, there's a lot of tasty details in here, and I definitely found this useful for making my own D-guard Bowie knife. Alright, well hopefully you guys enjoyed this little video. Maybe you learned something about the D-handled Bowie knives. If you're new to this channel, I'm actually primarily a knife making channel. I'm going to be having a video of the making of this knife coming out pretty soon, so if you want to see that, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And to all my faithful followers, I really appreciate the support. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be more Viking.